At the turn of the 20th century, a man named Chaim came to Manchester. His activity here over 3 decades dramatically influenced the Middle East and therefore the world. Chaim Weizmann was one of 15 children born in what is now Belarus, which was then part of the Russian Empire at the time. His father was a timber merchant, but he was sent to a Jewish school where he would learn Hebrew, and from an early age he was passionate about Zionism. Showing an aptitude for science, he studied in Germany and Switzerland, where he received his PhD in chemistry, and wherever he went he mixed in Zionist groups. Having lectured in Geneva, he moved to Manchester in 1904, taking up a research post in the chemistry department of the University of Manchester, having failed to get a lecturing spot in London. And in 1910, it was Winston Churchill who, at only 35 years old as Home Secretary, signed his papers to become a British citizen. And having only been in Manchester a short time, he wrote to the European Zionist leader describing the conditions in Manchester as frightful, in fact beyond description. He said, "You are dealing with the dregs of Russian Jewry, a dull, ignorant crowd that knows nothing of issues such as Zionism." He continued, "You cannot imagine what it means for an intellectual to live in the English provinces and work with the local Jews. It's hellish torture." You know, it makes you wonder, did he witness some of the Jewish people in the Manchester slums, such as Angel Meadow? And did this drive his passion deeper for a return to the land so they could be free from the disease-infested ghettos? However, Weizmann attracted a bunch of Jewish men who would be drawn into his Zionist movement and provide much needed funding. Simon Marx and Israel CF were central to the group. These were action men more than they were thinkers. They were busy transforming Marks and Spencer from a small family business into a nationwide retail giant. And Weizmann affectionately referred to them as the David and Jonathan of British retail. It was CF's home in Didsbury, just down the road from here, that became the hub of the Manchester Zionist movement. Apparently, to begin with, they would call themselves the Manchester School of Zionism. Harry Seicher, also mentored by Weizmann, drove the Zionist media, and he's been described as a fiercely intelligent journalist working for the Manchester Guardian. Their wives were just as passionate for the Zionist group as the men, although I guess it's unsurprising when you learn that Israel CF and Harry Seicher married sisters of Simon Marx, and in return he married CF's sister. They were a tight bunch. They were all second-generation Jewish immigrants. And you know, if it wasn't for this group, perhaps Weizmann would have left England and his place in history unmarked. Weizmann said this of the group. He said, "They were a great spiritual find." He said, "Here were people with whom problems could be discussed, with whom I could check and verify my ideas and gauge how they would impress others. They were readier for action than I, who was often hesitant and overcautious." Very honest. London Jewish politics was complex and fractious. 200 miles north in Manchester, a unified, tight fellowship, breaking bread in each other's homes, was conceiving Balfour. A scientist and a bunch of ambitious young Jewish intellectuals and businessmen launched an upstart campaign which culminated in the Declaration of 1917. I must mention Charles Prestwich Scott, who took out big loans to buy the Manchester Guardian in those years, and he would eventually take ownership of the MEN, the Manchester Evening News. Scott and Weizmann hit it off immediately, and with Scott being a former politician with contacts and the editor of the local newspaper, it was a huge win for the movement. He gave full backing to his journalist Harry Seicher, and he became a staunch supporter of the Zionist cause. World War I began in July 1914, and the Ottoman Empire had become enemies of the British. And this band of brothers recognised that proposing a Jewish state protected by the British would secure the nucleus of the Middle East and therefore benefit UK military strategy. In his research at the University of Manchester, Wiseman became the father of industrial fermentation. In 1915, he was able to produce acetone, which was used in the manufacture of cordite explosive propellants. And Winston Churchill and David Lloyd George, who was the Minister of Munitions at the time, became aware of Wiseman's discovery, and they both encouraged him in further development. Wiseman transferred the rights to manufacture of acetone to a corporation in New York in exchange for royalties, and now the United States could set about production. World War I was well underway, and so 6 British distilleries produced 30,000 tons of acetone during the war, thanks to Wiseman. So Wiseman was made the director of the British Admiralty Laboratories from 1916 until 1919, and the gravity of his accomplishments in the lab won him favour with the British government, allowing him access to key cabinet members. He would use this access to express his Zionist concepts. Full of energy, Wiseman's activity reached well beyond Manchester. Early doors of his stay here, he visited Jerusalem for the first time in 1907, and unlike most of us that are taking selfies and buying souvenirs, he helped organise the Palestine Land Development Company as a practical means of pursuing the Zionist dream, and also to found the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. As you do. Years later, he would return to do a fundraiser with Albert Einstein. As you do. He became the head of the Zionist group, the Democratic Fraction. He attended all but the first Zionist Congress, and with many a train journey south, Wiseman set up a separate following in London. Arthur Balfour was a Conservative MP representing one of the districts of Manchester around 1906, and Wiseman grabbed the opportunity to meet with him at the Manchester Queen's Hotel, which has since been demolished. Arthur Balfour had resigned as Prime Minister in the December before that same year, and he'd also supported the Aliens Act 1905, the objective being to manage and restrict Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe. Balfour supported the concept of a Jewish homeland, but he suggested to Wiseman there would be more support in Parliament for the British Uganda programme, an idea at the time in the early 1900s to give a portion of British East Africa to the Jewish people as a homeland. You know, it kind of baffles me how much influence us Brits had around the world. The empire was an astonishing thing. Meeting a second time with Wiseman, he turned to Balfour and he said this: "Would you give up London to live in Saskatchewan?" And Balfour said, "But we've always lived in London." And Wiseman replied, "Yes, and we lived in Jerusalem when London was still a marsh." Balfour was moved to tears, saying, "It is a great cause, and I understand it. It is not a dream." In 1915, Charles Prestwich Scott of the Manchester Guardian brought Wiseman to meet David Lloyd George, then the Chancellor of the Exchequer. David Lloyd George was born in Manchester to Welsh parents. He went to an Anglican school and his father taught Sunday school. His evangelical background meant that he was open to Wiseman's charm of the Zionist cause, and Lloyd George was an outspoken kind of guy and unafraid to row against the tide. As if God was steering the whole thing, the following year in 1916, David Lloyd George took office as Prime Minister, and who did he appoint Foreign Secretary? Arthur Balfour. Wiseman was now positioned in such a way that he had the backing of the key decision makers in government. And meanwhile, Sacher, CF and Marx formed and funded the British Palestine Committee. Their friend Herbert Sidebottom, another Manchester journalist, assisted. The committee published a pamphlet called Palestine on the 26th of January 1917, which advocated a Jewish Palestine under British protection. The Manchester Zionists led by Wiseman, multiplied their unity, achieving a community of Jewish people in Britain that, in the most part, had one mind, and through persuasion and passion and God incidents, were now complemented by the British state. In the April of 1917, Wiseman was invited for breakfast with Arthur Balfour, and they discussed international control, the Russian Revolution, and the US involvement in the future of what was then termed the Palestine problem. Balfour was convinced by Wiseman's notion for a national home in the land of Israel. More meetings followed, including at Downing Street on the 20th of April, where the idea was moved up the agenda as a matter of urgency. Chaim Wiseman became the president of the British Zionist Federation in the October of 1917, working with Arthur Balfour on the historic declaration. The Foreign Office wrote to Wiseman and to Lord Rothschild, the leaders of the British Jewish community, asking them to send over their proposal for a Jewish homeland. And then it came on the 2nd of November 1917, Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour wrote to Lord Rothschild. In it he declared, "His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country." Those words, national home for the Jewish people, this was the peak of British relations. It may have been signed in London, birthed in London, but it was the busy bees of industrial Manchester that conceived the milestone, devised in the drawing rooms of Didsbury and Fallowfield in Manchester, developed in the laboratories of the university here, and the typewriters of the Manchester Guardian. Wiseman's campaign had thrust right to the very heart of the British establishment and won a famous victory. Wiseman's job wasn't finished. He would continue to meet with cabinet members, including David Lloyd George and Arthur Balfour. In the wake of the Balfour Declaration, the Manchester group with their wives were sent by the British government to the land of Israel, and the women were struck by the impoverished conditions, which inspired them to form the Women's International Zionist Organization. Wiseman would later return to the land of Israel to look for rare minerals in the Dead Sea for the British war effort. Many had been involved in the Balfour Declaration, but few doubted that it was the audacious Chaim Wiseman, the Jewish Russian chemist living in Manchester, who had led the charge. I love this by Israel CF. In his memoirs, he says this: "Wiseman behaved as though he had a great Jewish state behind him. In fact, all he had was his handful of Manchester friends, Scott, Sacher, Simon Marks and me." British policy wavered over the next few decades, but the 1917 Declaration gave the concept a legitimacy which is still revered today. Wiseman and Balfour remained friends until Balfour's death in 1930. During World War II, Wiseman was made honorary advisor to the British Ministry of Supply. Wiseman's son Benjamin settled in Ireland and became a dairy farmer. His son Michael was a flight lieutenant for the RAF. His plane was shot down over the Bay of Biscay in February 1942, and his body was never found. Wiseman found it difficult to come to terms with. 31 years after the Balfour Declaration, Israel would become a reality. On the 16th of May 1948, just 2 days after the proclamation of the State of Israel, Wiseman succeeded Ben-Gurion as chairman of the Provisional State Council. This was a collective presidency to hold power before the first parliamentary election. Wiseman was nominated as Mapai's candidate for president when the first Knesset met in 1949. The election was in the February of 49.
Chaim Wiseman, who birthed a Zionist movement in Manchester leading to the Balfour Declaration, became the first elected president of Israel.
He had held his British nationality until 1948 when he renounced it to assume his position as President of Israel. Weizmann, as president, then entrusted Ben-Gurion with forming a government. A new kibbutz was named President's Village. I won't bother pronouncing it in Hebrew. It was founded just opposite the Golan in northern Israel. And in November the same year, on the anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, the Daniel C.F. Institute, which had been completely redeveloped, was renamed the Weizmann Institute of Science. Weizmann would later meet with President Harry Truman to gain support of the United States for the establishment of the State of Israel. 10 of his 11 surviving siblings made Aliyah. Weizmann and his family had lived in Manchester for about 30 years. In his memoirs, Trial and Error, he looks back on the group that became family to him, and he says this: "In short, they helped to make Manchester, the city I had come to as a stranger and had considered a place of exile, a happy place for me." He eventually grew to enjoy life in Manchester, including raising his children here. The Jewish community here flourished too. Chaim died in November 52. He's buried beside his wife in the garden of his home on the Weizmann estate, located on the grounds of the Weizmann Institute in Israel. Karl Marx witnessed his fellow Jews both wealthy and impoverished. Ashamed of his ethnicity, he was stirred to communism. Weizmann, on the other hand, with similar observations, was proud of his people and sought to return to their homeland. Two very different Jewish exports from Manchester. The Manchester Guardian became The Guardian in 1959, and its sister papers followed suit. Today, The Guardian is a very left-wing media outlet, a national media outlet. I think it's safe to say that if the same people running it today were back in the early 1900s, they wouldn't be supporting Weizmann and the Zionist movement. Writing for the Jewish Chronicle, David Sugarman says of The Guardian, "For decades, Britain's most prominent left-wing paper has promoted those denying anti-Semitism on the wider left, contributing to today's toxic climate for British Jews." To think that the government of David Lloyd George and Arthur Balfour were liberal in 1917. Today's liberal parties are very different. They were 1,000 miles left of a century ago. How do we stand as a city in light of the Abrahamic covenant? I'm not sure we fare too well. We have a very liberal left-wing culture, and all too often in Britain that tends to slide into anti-Semitism. It's rare to witness a church here say anything to do with Israel's election within God's redemptive plans. Replacement theology is lapped up. The idea of a Jewish kingdom is unfathomable. Today, Manchester has a community of around 25,000 Jews, the largest in the UK outside of London. A number of Jewish followers of Jesus also. May God bless them.